Well, thanks so much for being here. Good afternoon. I'm Stesha Brandon. I'm the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. And as we begin today, I want to take just a minute to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past, present, and future, and we thank them for their stewardship of this land. And I'll also mention that as a library, we're a great place to find resources if you are interested in learning more about colonization and its impact on Native people and Native lands. Welcome to today's program presented in partnership with Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, the National Library of Ireland, Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, and Seattle UNESCO City of Literature. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. First, I'd like to thank our series sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation and the Seattle Times, for their generous support of library programs. And we want to offer big thanks to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everybody in our community. If you find that you need assistive listening during the program, you can just give me a little wave. We have assistive listening devices at the table, and you can just give me a little wave and I'll bring you one if you find that that might make it a little easier for you to hear. And finally, I just wanted to mention that we have a survey that you can fill out at the end of the program. They are on the table, so as you're heading out into the afternoon or on to the Mariners game, you can grab a survey and fill that out at the end of the program. Now I am delighted to welcome Caroline Cumming from Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, who's going to introduce today's program. Caroline.
Thank you, Stesha, and welcome everyone. It's been quite a weekend. So I am the Executive Director of Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, and we are a member-supported library and cultural center in Pike Place Market overlooking Elliott Bay. We have over 800 members who support us and come to visit the library to check out our collection and to attend programs to be a quiet place for reading and writing and participate in our wonderful book discussions led by Lillian Dabney, who I just see over there. Right. We are the first Athenaeum to be founded in America in over 100 years. The original libraries in America were subscription-based libraries, and right up until Carnegie started funding libraries, and then of course we have our own public library system. There are still over 20 Athenaeums and member-supported libraries in America, and we meet annually to discuss our libraries and the work that we're doing in community. We are very much focused on being a gathering place for community, for readers and writers and people engaged in civic life in our cities. I would now like to introduce you to our panel. I will start with Dr. Audrey Whitty, who is joining us from Dublin. Dr. Audrey Whitty is the director of the National Library of Ireland. She's a curator, art historian, and archaeologist. She was previously the deputy director of the National Museum of Ireland, as well as head of collections and learning at the NMI. As a curator, she is motivated by creating powerful visions and strategies for meaningful collections. At the National Museum of Ireland, she created the impactful exhibition Alison Lowry, Addressing Our Hidden Truths, which explores the Magdalen laundries in Ireland. She has worked as a curator specializing in ceramic, glass, and Asian collections at both the NMI and the Corning Museum of Glass in New York. A graduate and postgraduate of University College Dublin, she also has a doctorate from Trinity College Dublin in History of Art. She has authored over 90 publications and has lectured internationally, including at the Museum of Glass here in Tacoma. Welcome, Audrey. Tom Fay is most likely a very familiar face around here. He has served as the Executive Director and Chief Librarian of the Seattle Public Library since 2022. He had been serving as interim chief librarian since 2021 and previously held the role of director of programs and services beginning in 2015, overseeing public services and programs, collections, materials handling, and information technology across the Central Library and all 26 branches. A native of Southern Nevada, Fay began his 38-year library career as a page at the Las Vegas Clark Clark County Library District before advancing to leadership roles, including Executive Director of Henderson Libraries and Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Las Vegas Clark County Library District. He holds a Fine Arts degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a Master's in Library and Information Science from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His accomplishments include being named Nevada's Librarian of the Year and receiving the O'Callaghan Public Sector Person of the Year Award. Tom Fay. And last but not least, the wonderful Lillian Dabney. Lillian has been involved in every aspect of the book, from fierce reader to bookbinder, and is an advocate of all things literary. She received a master's degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Washington and worked at the Seattle Public Library as an on-call reference and reader services librarian. She has served on the board of the Washington Book Arts Guild and Friends of the Seattle Public Library. Lillian joined Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, in 2018, where she now facilitates several of our book discussion groups, including the 400 Years of Racism series, the Long Novel Study, and classic fiction discussion groups. And I know that there are people in this room today who will sign up every time Lillian has another book discussion. From 2019 to 2021, Lillian served on the American Library Association Notables Award Committee that selects 25 notable titles of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry for libraries across the country. In 2022, she served as a judge for the Kirkus Nonfiction Award Committee, and in 2023 as a judge for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence Committee, co-sponsored by the American Library Association and Booklist. She reads a lot. She is also a discussion leader for the San Francisco chapter of the Great Books, and currently she reviews books of literary fiction and literature in translation for Booklist. And I have the great privilege of working with Lillian every day.
Caroline, thank you for that amazing introduction. And I am so thrilled to be having a conversation about the future of libraries with Dr. Whitty and Tom. So thank you for being here. I want to begin with a poem because poetry says things in so few words. All right, this is a poem by George Crabbe called From the Library. But what strange art, what magic can dispose the troubled mind to change its native woes, or lead us as willing from ourselves to see others more wretched, more undone than we? This books can do. Nor this alone, they give new views to life and teach us how to live. They soothe. And Dr. Whitty, is there any kind of digital inequity in Ireland that you have to address or pay attention to?
Oh, absolutely, and it was very pronounced during the pandemic, particularly at primary school level, post-primary as well. But as Tom said there, some families didn't have, let's say, a number of different devices in their house. They were sharing one if they were lucky. So unfortunately, that accentuation between the haves and the have-nots in our society in terms of people having the various resources within their own private realm was very, very much brought more to the fore. It's a huge issue. You shouldn't have to have access to literature and culture, history, all the subjects that you need through a device that isn't available. I mean, the most democratic thing in the world is to give the opportunity to learn to every child. So it is an issue for us. And things have been done through the Department of Education, as well as through, let's say, local libraries, and in ourselves, we'd be a national culture institution. So technically we sit under another government area, which would be the Culture Department. But we've all come together to try and give as much of the resource as possible, particularly in schools. They have upped the game there enormously. But unfortunately, you're still really tied into the private realm of the home. and what is there and what's not there.
Right.
And that's where libraries, particularly public libraries, and what Tom and his team do here, are so extraordinary, because they level the playing field. They give every child a chance.
Yeah. Tom, how do we address this digital equity? I mean, it's going to grow. It's going to become more pervasive. So how do we address it?
Well, in public libraries, we try to address it on a number of fronts, right? Because there's going to be a variety of places people come to us from. So if you're an immigrant and you don't understand the culture, and maybe the language is not your first language, maybe you don't speak it at all, that's where the library is a resource. We offer that skills training and language training, again, to be able to hopefully get parents and families to be able to start that next step of participating in society, in civics, correct? And trying to look at how can we then move to citizenship. However that's going to be defined in these tumultuous times, but how do we make sure that we're working to move people to that status as well, because that also then leads to better economic conditions, better jobs, and we're also a resource for that. How do you start a business? We have an entire library to business program throughout our library system that can help you from starting a food truck to starting some other type of service type of business, to any type of business that you can imagine. I mean, some of the things they're working on right now with folks is great. We work again with a lot of partners doing this work. This isn't just the library. It takes the community and the community's commitment. I think we see that with the support we get here in Seattle for the Seattle Public Libraries, the foundation. When we go out to the voters and ask for those levies, they're there. They see the results. We're creating a society that people want to live in, and that they want to participate in, and that they're proud of. And that's the work that we do every day, and my team does every day.
Yeah, collaboration and partnerships is just going to be the way to move forward. You touched earlier about funding and how precarious that is. And Dr. Whitty, how is funding an issue in Ireland or not?
We kind of would be seen as obviously an arm of government, even though we're a semi-state non-commercial agency that was set up technically as a semi-state body in 2005, even though we've been in existence since 1877. So it was a strange change, I think. It had a board of trustees, then it went to a board of directors ultimately. So the chief executive, myself, would answer to the board of directors since 2005. But in terms of funding, it's still entirely under government. And what's interesting is that even pre-independence in 1922, it was under the British administration, then the Irish administration, since 1922 onwards. So its entire funding is from government, more or less. It's about 98.9%. So I think what we do in Ireland well is capital investment through government. There's no problem necessarily getting bricks and mortar in Ireland out of government. But what we do have an issue with, again, is the staffing, because of the, I suppose, the fact that you would have the pension liability at the end. Yeah. So it's what we would call in Ireland the current versus the capital expenditure. And also we have a lot to learn through the philanthropy of the United States in terms of those foundations. We do have the National Library of Ireland Foundation, or it's called the National Library of Ireland Trust, which is a kind of a philanthropic wing. But nothing on the scale of what obviously you are doing here in Seattle Public Library System. So it's always a challenge. The only thing I would say, to go back to your point about collaboration, is that is definitely the future, definitely, and particularly in programming. For instance, we did a thing with the Environmental Protection Agency recently, where we looked at old photographs, late 19th, 20th century, of the landscape and seascape of Ireland, and then through competition, a major photographer won the residency, looking at the effect certain environmental conditions had had on said landscape and seascape 100 years later or more, and other things besides. We won an award then recently for that. So there's there's so much we can do with other bodies, whether it be public or private.
Yeah. All right. So along with this wonderful current Irish festival that's going on, it is also Banned Books Week. And this was created by the American Library Association to explore ways of addressing and promoting intellectual freedom. So in the past few years, maybe since the pandemic, book challenges and censorship have escalated to an alarming degree. Tom perhaps will talk a bit about this, and then we'll ask Dr. Whitty about what's going on in Ireland. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been probably the most concerning for me in the last 3 to 5 years. I've been in libraries 43 years, so I've seen every kind of thing from the moral majority to every other kind of moms group or parents group over the years. And I think this last period of time has been staggering. I'm looking at my notes here because I wanted to make sure I had it right. There's been over 23,000 cases of book bans across 45 states and in 451 school districts primarily just since 2021. It's a staggering number. Nothing like that ever in my career. Even when we look at it from the public library realm, those numbers have increased in the last 3 years 20% a year in attempts to do so. And those are the things that, you know, are concerning. But one of the bigger concerns is what we often call soft or hidden censorship, where people just take things off the shelf because of their personal belief. They move it around the library where it can't be found. There's a variety of things that can happen as you look at these communities where these debates are going on. And Washington's not immune. Dayton Library in Eastern Washington was almost shut down by a small group of people just 2 years ago in an attempt to block LGBTQ books from being represented in their community. So that's really why, you know, when this was all starting to really happen, you know, there was a lot of talk, well, why don't we put out a statement? I said, well, how about we actually do something? Our colleagues in Brooklyn had been working on a program called Books Unbanned. We'd been in discussions with them. And of course, there's always the, how can we get, you know, notice? And I said, that's not what we need. We need collaboration. If we're going to win this fight or fight this fight, we need to band together to make sure that we're providing as much as we can. And so we were the first to join our colleagues in Brooklyn in Books Unbanned. And that program now, in 2.5 years, has circulated over 1 million books to over 51,000 young people across the country and the U.S. territories. And I'm proud to say that Seattle Public Library has carried 575,000 of those checkouts and 20,000 people. So that's all due to generous donors. That is all privately funded to make that available. But every single state in this union, and every story from fear of checking something out because they may be of the LGBT community to I live in a rural area and I'll never see this. There's no access to this information. And so those are very important pieces. That's my concern more than anything, is that we will have entire parts of this country, regions, cities, towns, where a kid may grow up and not know something exists at all. That's the kind of thing we're talking about now with the depth of these bans in schools, the attempt to push it out into public libraries. That's what we're talking about. A kid could grow up and not know that there's this option or this science or this medical procedure. All of those things are real if we continue with these bans.
Yeah, we want to keep people reading. We definitely want to keep people reading. And Dr. Whitty, and do you have any book challenges in Ireland?
Not like that,
No.
but that's not to say that we haven't in the past. So we've been through that. We've been through a horrendous time in the 1920s, all the way up to the 1960s, even early 70s, where the Catholic Church had an enormous influence on what was seen as good literature versus bad literature. And some of our most extraordinary writers, like James Joyce in particular, were banned up until really the late 1960s, early 70s. You could add in Edna O'Brien being denounced from the pulpit. You know, the list goes on and on. And a lot of our great writers were exiles ultimately as a result of that in the early to mid 20th century in particular. So we empathize as a people with this. We really do, because even though it's not like that for us now, thank goodness, that we really have a huge psychological trace of that left in terms of the our oral history of the 20th century. and we don't want to see it come back. Having said that, anti-LGBT group protest, or a number of them, particularly in the Cork area, actually, is something that we are still grappling with. But thankfully, our laws, the legal system, doesn't differentiate between regions in terms of any of that. It's a small country, as you know. It's only about 5.4 million people in the Republic of Ireland, and another 2.8 actually 2.5 in the north. So it's very, you would not be able to just take it upon yourself to ban books or to somehow denude your library. You'd be held responsible by the law.
Well, we appreciate you looking at us and sending us good vibes so that we can get through this. Now, circling back to where we began with the dangers and the obstacles facing libraries today, libraries across the country, across the world. What are some of the steps? We've mentioned some of them here. Collaboration is one, partnership is another. Try to get more staff. Does anybody want to become a librarian? We need more librarians. But what are some of the other steps we need to take to ensure the survival of libraries? Dr. Whitty, I'll start with you.
Such an amazing question, Lillian. I was thinking about this when I think the main thing is promotion of what we do, and getting like-minded people in various different areas of society to help protect and promote that. The first line, I would have said this the other evening in Town Hall on Friday, but the first line in the National Cultural Institutions Act, which the National Library of Ireland falls under, is to preserve. And ultimately, I think all libraries, apart from the accessibility and the engagement piece, which obviously makes it relevant in terms of public interaction, but that first word of preserve is so extraordinarily important. We have to protect the literature. We have to somehow encompass all of it, acquire all of it, and then disseminate it through all the various different ways that we do. So for me, it's more a question of getting buy-in across various different segments, whether it be the public sector or the private sector, to get those champions at a much more senior level, perhaps, than ever before. So, try and go for the governor of the state of Washington, or whatever it happens to be. Aim high, get those people behind you, because they do matter. That's where the power resides, and you have to go after the power.
Yeah, so true. Tom?
Yeah, I agree. It's the advocacy piece. And here in Seattle, that's what I spent my 4 years in this role doing, is working with our friends of the library, our foundation, to build that advocacy network. We actually have what we call the Public Library Action Network, and folks can join that. We don't bombard you with messages, but when we need help with city council, the state, or even at the federal level, we now have it. We have almost 1,200 people registered to do that. We have them in every district. So when something goes on, we can put people in town hall meetings. We can have people sending emails. And that is power, because that's the voice, right? They know that's their voters. That's not just Tom coming up here and saying libraries are important. They're going to go, yeah, we know. But when you come in and you say, no, it's really important, and I vote for you, that's a different story. And then I think about really the areas that we need to stay relevant in is this real concern that we have around reading. Even leisure reading here in this country, it's dropped 40% over the last several years. When we look at school achievement by third grade, those numbers have not been great. In Seattle, they're horrendous. And for black and brown children, they're really bad, and they just haven't moved. So the library has to say, what else can we do? We can create a lot of fences around, well, we're not going to put something in a school. Well, why not? They're our patrons. So we're doing a pilot this year to, it's going to be called Story Squad, taking books out, at least in the beginning, to Title I schools in the classrooms. Having things that there's a joy of reading. It's not just about learning to read, but a joy. Do I see somebody that looks like me in the book? Do I see something I even have an interest in? How can we do that and make that available to teachers, instead of teachers spending their time, valuable time, trying to find those resources or spending their own money to do it? They're our patrons. We have the ability to buy more books at a better discount than anybody else in the state, being the Seattle Public Library. So how can we make that happen, and then make it happen at scale? That's the relevancy then, and that's where we start moving from just some basic outcomes to real impact, where we move those needles around reading. That's what we want to be able to do.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. Reading is amazing. It connects people. It helps you learn about yourself. It helps you learn about others, and it helps you find your place in the world. So I'm just so happy to hear you say that. Well, I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. So thank you, Dr. Whitty. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lillian.
So wonderful. So is Tesha here? Oh, sure. So yeah, if there are any questions in the audience, Stesha will run a microphone up to you. Yeah.
That's great. Questions? We have one right here.
Tom, when you mentioned the figure $1 million, was that $1 million, let's see, this was for the banned books. Was that $1 million different titles or $1 million requests?
No, it was 1 million checkouts of a variety of titles. So it's a big number in 2.5 years. There's 6 library systems now in the country that participate. So Boston, LA County does it regionally within the state. Long Beach in California as well. I think I said Boston. So we've got about five or six that are participating in it now, and hopefully always growing it, because I think the more, everyone says, well, what will that do? And I'm like, well, the more that we have out there, the less that they can say it doesn't exist, right? I just heard today that I believe it was a teacher just got either reprimanded. I think she got reprimanded and she resigned because she provided a QR code for resources. I'm sure it was probably us or Brooklyn for her students, and it was in a state that had been banning some of this material. So the fight is not, it's not going to stay out there only in those states that are banning, but they'll come after states that are providing the information. So we know that this is the kind of thing that we'll see over the next, sadly, probably next 2 or 3 years as some of this plays out.
There's another question in the middle there.
Better. Oh, that's too good. You mentioned ebooks costing 3 to 5 times what regular books do. That seems counterintuitive to me, because the cost of producing a physical book has got to be much higher. Can you talk about why that is?
Oh, we might be here a while. So everyone here, I'm looking around the room, other than a few younger folks here, remembers the days of Napster and music, right? So the music industry really was on the bad end of that stick, so to speak, at the beginning. The publishing industry got smarter because they saw that. And so what they did was, instead of the Fair Use Act, which is what allows us to circulate physical materials, meaning we can buy a copy and loan it as long as that thing will live, right? They said that their product is software. And as software, all those rules are off. And so with that, they can then charge basically whatever they want. There's no Fair Use Act, meaning I own nothing. So in most cases, unless they offer an opportunity to buy one item in perpetuity, I have a collection of 1.1 million e-materials. I probably own 10,000, if that. So one of the things we're working on this year, coming up in the legislature, is to join on Connecticut's effort, because they need one more state of at least 7 million to join it, to really start saying, okay, we need to ask these people, how are you charging other library systems in other states? How can we start saying, making this more transparent about these costs? Because we are, from the standpoint of good stewards of tax dollars, and all of you as taxpayers, why can you as a consumer buy that audiobook for $16.99 and the library has to pay $65 for it? And I have one copy of it. It's even sometimes worse in ebooks, in that I might actually have to buy, I'll buy one, and then I only get 26 checkouts on that. Or let's say I buy one and it's a flop, and I have 2 years left on that subscription, And now I have 2 years of a flop, and I'm still paying for it, and no one's checking it out. Unlike a physical material that I could actually get rid of, sell off with our friends or whatever. So it's become a real issue. And when you look at the usage, it's intense, the number of people after the pandemic. So we really have had to balance our budgets in a different way from physical to E. And you're right, it is in many ways cheaper to produce than physical material. They have the cost of not only the the author, they do have the entertainer who's doing the voiceovers. So I mean, they have some additional costs, but truly it is not the same cost as a physical book.
We have a question up here.
Hello. Tom, you alluded to the fact that Seattle's population is growing. I think I read in the paper that our population's growing at the 4th highest rate of any city in the United States. In years gone by, or eras gone by, we probably would have been able to build additional public library branches to handle the increase in population and then demographic switches or changes within the city. What would be involved in the city of Seattle to get the resources together to actually build a new branch? Would that be possible? And if that is kind of possible or would be possible, what kind of a branch would we build? How would the resources be utilized, and how would you decide where it might go? And Dr. Whitty, if there's anything you can tell us about building new libraries in Ireland, please weigh in after Tom.
Yeah, so it's, there's a couple pieces to this. Is it possible? Yes. Are there a couple things that also concern me about additional buildings? And that would be a yes. We have 27 locations, and this building now is 21 years old. It is moving to life cycle, which is 30 years, not meaning it's going to fall down, but those are all the things that break that have air conditioning and all that kind of stuff. So when you start looking at all of your physical plants across the entire system being kind of in that same boat, we're looking right now at over $200 million in maintenance, capital maintenance needs over the next decade to decade and a half for all of these buildings. So we haven't touched on improvements. We can do some improvements in that, but that might be something like, well, the carpet looks better, the floor looks better. It's not rearranging the space. So that's one piece that we need to look at, and we'll look at that in both general fund, we'll look at it in future levies. But if we look at really wanting to do a new space, that's going to take a capital bond, where we would actually probably go out to the voters and either do it over a long period of time, or we might just do it over a short period of time. But yes, we would do it. And I think those spaces have to be different than what we see traditionally here in Seattle as a library. That doesn't mean it won't have books, but it's got to be more open form, meaning that it can be used in many different ways. And I think about this, a good example of this is our South Park Library. It is primarily Latino community. And really, the need that they have there is for gathering and for community events, to be able to have programming and youth programming and all of these things. So we literally roll everything off the floor so that can happen. And so having flex spaces like that, there's still material. All the other services still come in. But how do we make it be something like that? If we want to be a do-it-yourself training lab, can we roll that in and out? Those are the things we need to look at, so that we're not building these things that are very inflexible, because we don't know what the next 25, 30, 40 years are going to bring. Probably more electronic, less physical. So we don't want to have a space that's so set. You can walk right up now on the spiral of this building. Wonderful. And it will always be an edifice to the physical book. But that space isn't really usable for a whole lot more, because it was designed to do one thing. That's not what we want for another building that has to be lasting 30 to 50 years or more.
It sounds like not partnerships, collaboration, and flexibility and adaptability are so important. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, totally agree, Lillian. Just in terms of the National Library of Ireland, we're going through a major capital development. The first major overhaul of the western side of our building since it was built in 1890. So we're on track to open that in 2028. It's tens of millions of euro. I can't give a specific figure, unfortunately, because I'm bound by the conditions of the tender that's about to be given the green light by the Minister for Culture. He'll be publishing that hopefully by the end of this year. So then the public will know the overall figure. The bill of quantities have just been sorted out by a body called our Office of Public Works, who technically own all of our state buildings, which is a very similar thing with the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Again, they don't own their building like we don't own our building. So we're going through a major overhaul. It was a book repository for 350,000 volumes, this western side, which is literally called the West Wing of the NLI. And it'll be 6 floors of exhibition space on Seamus Heaney, on obviously a revamped Yeats exhibition, Edna O'Brien, Bob Geldof, Band Aid, Live Aid Trust donation, and many other important writers, maybe even Mariah Edgeworth of the early 19th century, who was Jane Austen's favourite novelist. But unfortunately, we only know one of those names in history, not Mariah Edgeworth, who was from County Longford in Ireland. And we're also going to put in what you would normally see in a major city in terms of a public library, this learning resource space, a hangout zone for the people of Dublin. Because at the moment, because it's a research reference library, you have to be 16 years of age or over to basically interact with the collections proper by way of a reader's ticket outside of the exhibitions, which are obviously for everyone. And I'm a real believer you get people in as early as possible. 16 is too late, in my opinion. And even though we have a public library system in the city, the National Library should be aiming for younger than that. So that's our capital development at the moment. Yeah.
Yep, we have a question up here.
First off, thank you guys for spending the time to have this go down today. I have a couple questions. The first one is in regards to new books, the inventory of new books and new information, and how the library plans to monitor human creation versus automation or AI creation. So that's my first question. And then the second question is, what is the library doing and what can we do as individuals to help that trend of people not reading flip courses and start to build back up? Because that intellectual freedom is something that seems to be a leverage point for not only individuals but as a collective community as well.
So on the AI front, I'll come back to the staff and the people part of it. So that's a critical part. So when we order things, we may get a list from a vendor that we buy from, but those lists are actually reviewed by selection librarians. And when they're going through that, they're looking at a number of things. You know, is it something that's going to be relevant for where we're at? Is it something that's in demand? All kinds of information like that. But they're also looking for that AI stuff. Because most of that is pretty horrendous, you know, and it's just not good. And yes, over time, it probably will get better, but there has to be in this country a reckoning with both the ethics of that and the kind of the intellectual side of that, if that's what we want as a people, right? Do we want to deny authorship? Do we want to deny that intellectual expression and have it come from a machine? So I think those are things that the country as a whole is going to reckon with. I think the library, we've established here in the last 2 months an AI policy. So even simple things, and I'll give you an example of something I just did for my colleagues. The statewide library directors group wanted me to do a presentation on futures research in libraries. And we had done a big study on this a few years ago, and it was a 119-page document. And I said, hey, just chat GTP or no, Copilot, it was one of them. I said, take this 119 pages and focus on the 15 pages and give me a PowerPoint. And it did it. And then I went through and individually reviewed each of the pieces, the data points, because by policy, that's what it says I have to do. Everything we produce as a library has to be reviewed, and we acknowledge that a certain portion of this was created by AI. So if you see something come from the library, If it doesn't say that, then it doesn't have AI. In that case, I showed my colleagues, I did this. I also independently reviewed each of these pieces and make sure that they're in fact valid. And maybe you want to take that second part.
Just on very quickly on AI, there's one thing that I think people aren't thinking of, and from an Irish perspective and other smaller nations of the world, it's really important. There's a thing called the large language models that feeds AI. And if you have the large language models be predominantly in the English language or Mandarin, French, German, it's basically perpetuating an imperial system. That's a huge problem, in my opinion, as an Irish woman, because you're completely discounting languages like Gaeilge, like the Irish language, like other languages that are not spoken as prolifically as English or Spanish or Mandarin. That is not acceptable, because you're dealing with an entity that will really have a cultural focus on maybe 5 languages. I mean, for me, that's absolutely shocking, and that's just a personal opinion.
Agree.
And it's not going to give anything to the body of knowledge, really, if you're only focused on 5 perspectives, ultimately, culturally speaking. But anyway, that in terms of getting people to read more, it's going to be difficult. It's not easy, and you have to do it obviously politically, but you have to start at grassroots. And the main thing for me is you can look at the Irish as a nation, and how we have proven that the only way to be a success, and when you have no money, and I'm talking about the 19th century now, or no real hope of self-determination at that time, is through education. The Irish were obsessed with education, and it starts with basic learning to read and write, and basic arithmetic, and look what has happened. I know it's 2025. It took, you could say that we've been a success a long time in the making, but ultimately that's why we're so obsessed with that level of education in Ireland, because the class system was debased as a result of a colonizer and a colonized, but it has given us no harm in terms of the perspective of literature, the basics of learning to read and write. But having said that, there are a lot of people who struggle with that. So we have a thing called the National Adult Literacy Agency, NALA, N-A-L-A, and there are a lot of adults in Ireland who have literacy problems. So we need to be very much more vocal about that. Call it out. There's the same all over the Western world, that and obviously every part of the global world and family. So that would be my take on that. Call out the adult literacy, in addition to showing that the only way you're going to be a success and have that kind of perpetuation of power is through learning how to read and write.
And demonstrate the joy of reading. I think that's the one thing that, for many of us here, yes, there was rigor in learning to read. I went to Catholic school. Yes, there was a lot of rigor. For sure. But at the end of the day, there was never a lack of joy for reading. And I think that's the thing, that as we demonstrate that to children, our children, that's what we want to do. And when we talk about that story squad I was talking about putting into the schools, we want kids to see themselves. We want to have them see their interests represented, instead of what often happens now in this country is only focusing on the test. And that is what has driven us to have kind of the death, the fear of reading that a lot of students have. There's a lot of judgment when those things are occurring. Where we see great inroads in that is a lot of our programs where judgment is put aside. I ran a program when I was in Henderson called Reading with Rover. It was all outcome driven, and was all with therapy dogs. And we would see kids go 3 grade levels behind, and within 8 weeks be catching up a grade level or 2, because the dogs don't judge; they just have love, right? I mean, and that's what reading is about. Taking that 10 minutes a night, 15 minutes if you've got the extra power to read to your child, you will give more to them there than you will by giving them a college education. It's just a proven fact.
We have time for 2 more questions. Let's say 3 more questions. We have one right here, and then I'll get to you 2.
Thank you. My question is, what is your relationship, if you would, or association, affiliation with the United States or what global, international, the education, the teaching system, school?
Get the last bit, sorry.
Do you have an affiliation with,
What is your affiliation? What is it with the education system?
Well,
The teaching, school.
teaching, yeah, well, we start huge, to be honest. We're not under the Department of Education, we're under the Department of Culture, but we would have primary and post-primary children coming through the National Library all the time. In fact, I want to build on it. We don't have, in my opinion, enough island-wide in terms of the classes coming into the building to be shown the W.B. Yeats exhibition or Seamus Heaney or our Live Aid exhibition on those 1985 concerts in JFK Stadium in Philadelphia and in Wembley in London that literally, generated millions for famine relief. But ultimately, we would have a huge system put in through our outreach and education department, and most national libraries would.
Tom, do you want to comment at all about our relationship, SPL's relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we have relationships, obviously, with the Seattle school system. We actually have partnerships. We have MOUs, agreements, let's put it that way, for data sharing and things like that. We, of course, do work with the University of Washington. We work on several research grants with them as well around reading and literacy. So that's how we're involved, at least at the education levels here in the state.
Thanks.
Hi, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much. I work for King County Library System, which is another public library system in the state. We talk a lot about KCLS about the loneliness crisis in this country and mental health crisis. And we really see the library as a place where people, and you guys have touched on this already, but a place where people can gather from story time to teens. We have teen nights, to older adults, crafting, so many different things. I'm curious if in Ireland, loneliness is a public health thing, frankly, in this country, if that's talked about in Ireland. And also mental health is just so important. There's so much focus on that in this country, and I'm really curious, the discussion in Ireland.
Loneliness has definitely become much more talked about, I think, since the pandemic in Ireland, and rightly so. There had been this extraordinary charity, it's still in existence, called Alone, that was founded in the early 1980s by a former firefighter called Willie Birmingham, that really was the first in Europe to kind of have a charity just looking at loneliness. But it didn't get the notoriety it deserved until much more recently with the pandemic. So, and obviously we've the mental health issues that you would get, unfortunately, in any modern society. We have one of the highest rates of suicide amongst young men. Particularly the travelling community in Ireland has a very high rate of suicide amongst men, which is an indigenous group that is, obviously been in Ireland for hundreds and hundreds of years, and extraordinary people. They have their own languages of cant and gammon, but the rate of suicide amongst young men in that community is shocking. So we are looking at that through programming, maybe not as much as I would like, but certainly we have a thing for, let's say, the over 65s that's focusing on loneliness.
And I think that's why we're trying to put more emphasis in these upcoming years on having those in-person programming sessions. It's really about connecting. I mean, a lot of the disconnect we see now is because social media allows us to have our own echo chambers. So you can't test what your opinion is like, but you also can't really connect with people even on things we might agree with. And I think that's where people are suffering the most. Many of us will avoid conflict, let's be honest, right? But even on those things that we love or cherish, we're not connecting. And you can only do so much of that through social media. And even though it might be interesting, you can read something, you can learn something, you didn't connect to anyone. Not really. Because you didn't spend time really understanding the person that's sitting right in front of you. Because they were just a talking head. We would listen to a lot of those on television every night.
Last question.
So mine is very much along the same lines as the loneliness and social disconnection. So I was wondering, so maybe you could say, and you mentioned this before, programming, if you had unlimited funding or if you had a dedicated grant, what sort of programming would you like to see in the libraries to help address the loneliness and social disconnection crisis that we're seeing? And I would say this, I personally think this is foundational work to fixing representative or strengthening representative democracy as well as wealth disparity and literacy and all the problems facing our world.
Well, at least to me in public libraries, it would be more intergenerational programming, which would be key, because I think that's where, you know, this is the, at least as we know it, the first time probably in history where you have so many generations actually living but also working together, right? There are many times there might have been almost as many living together, but most certainly not working and having to interact at those levels together. And that's where there is just the absolute lack of understanding, because we have, again, isolated ourselves in many ways, both through the pandemic doing it to us, but also then extending that through more social isolationism with the social media platforms. And for me, the intergenerational is where there's just the intensity of those connections. When you see that, if you watch an older adult with, let's say, a teen, and just, you know, it's going to be awkward at first, but once that starts working, like in our homework help programs that we do, it's amazing to see how people connect and how important those relationships are. Teens to struggling readers that are third grade readers or second grade readers or fourth grade readers, when you bring a kid in that's from their community, that's a teen, that may be the same color, may be the same ethnicity, whatever the case is, something that actually now they go, somebody who might understand me, it's huge, excuse me, how impactful that is to that person and that student, and how much more they will work to be better. Because again, in their mind, it's being demonstrated by that person that they know is from their community. And so when I talk about intergenerational, it's also about community, right? We also want a mixed community because we don't want that, but we also want to know intergenerationally within community, there's that building, right? Inclusion, belonging, then taking that out until our entire city is about inclusion and belonging. No one should live here that feels like they don't belong if we've done it right, and that's what we're trying to do.
Dr. Whitty, do you want to address that? Or?
It's a great question, because there's two programs at the moment in the National Library. One focused on a thing called Poetry Aloud, which is focusing on children from the age of 12 up to 19 who come in through their school system, and they speak the poetry of Yeats, and they choose another poem of their own choosing of any nationality anywhere in the world, and they also speak this. And this is obviously just off the top of the head, they have to learn it off by heart. It's been incredibly popular. It's now about 13 years in, and it's growing from strength to strength, and it's island-wide. So it's the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and you get this extraordinary trophy at the end of it, and it can go to any age group. You've got 3 categories, but sometimes the youngest will actually win the overall trophy. But what I'd love to do is marry that Poetry Aloud competition with another festival in Ireland called Bealtaine, which is for older people, 65 years or over, whereby they come into the library system or other national cultural institutions, sometimes for the first time in their entire lives, but they're interacting with their peers as opposed to young people. So to take Tom's point, if I could marry those two programs together, I think I'd be onto something. And you've just given me a great idea, so thank you.
Well, thank you, all 3 of you, for such a wonderful conversation. Let's give our panel a round of applause. And I do want to just thank the folks at Folio, the Seattle Athenaeum, for bringing this program to us. We're very grateful to them. And if you are not doing anything tonight, they have, I think, one more program for the closing of the festival that is centered on Edna O'Brien. So that's happening tonight. If you're not going to the Mariners game, go Ems. Let's see, I also want to thank the good folks at the National Library of Ireland for helping out today, and the folks at Dublin UNESCO City of Literature, Seattle UNESCO City of Literature, and of course all the folks that make the library programming possible, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, and the Seattle Times. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for coming out today. We'll see you next time.